I'm a member of Twin Cities DSA, and I'm so excited that we were able to put this together. Thank you to everyone who's tuning in right now, and thank you so much, especially to our panelists. We're going to be talking about a lot of awesome things tonight, but we're going to be mostly talking about what the PRO Act is. We're going to talk about what it does. We're going to talk about why it's important to fight for it. And we're going to talk about how it's not just part of how we make our economy democratic, but it's going to be part of our transition to save our globe from climate catastrophe as well, and ensure that we have a transition out of climate change that centers people before profits, that centers people before corporations. And so, yeah, I think to kick us off, we have a very special guest who, unfortunately, she was not able to make it here, but she did record a video message for us. And I'm going to kick it off here with a little video greeting from Representative Ilhan Omar. And just give me a moment here to share my screen. And make sure I'm sharing the audio as well.
Hello, Twin Cities DSA. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you all about the PRO Act today. And I know it's a few days early, but I also want to wish you all a happy May Day. The PRO Act is the most important piece of legislation for organized labor and the entire working class in a generation. And the work you are doing is how we're going to get it passed. The law will make more workers eligible for collective bargaining. It will make unions easier to organize. It will limit the power of management to sabotage the process and punish those who do more harshly. It will deliver better and speedier contracts to organized workers. It will end destructive right-to-work laws. And it will lend existing unions more muscle. The PRO Act would strengthen unions and the power of working class to organize on the job, helping to build labor power as strong as it needs to be in the months and years ahead to win a just transition to a green economy for all workers. We must pass the PRO Act to strengthen unions and restore power to workers. Organized labor built the middle class. And as we face the largest wealth disparities in 100 years, it will be organized labor that builds it back. Millionaires and billionaires, corporate boardrooms, the Chamber of Commerce, and bosses across the country are nervous as hell about this bill, and they should be, because this bill will reduce their power and give it back to the people who actually produce things, the workers. We have already passed the bill in the House. Now we have the support of the president, and now we have to organize and get it passed in the Senate by pushing few Democrats who have not signed on yet. Thank you so much again for everything that you are doing, for having me, and keep up the good work. In solidarity forever.
There you go. So, yeah, Representative Omar really stated it there, what the stakes are and what we're fighting for. This is a bill that is really going to take the stacked system that really is stacked against workers trying to join a union and really put a lot of power back in our hands. So, like I said, we're going to talk about a lot of cool aspects of the PRO Act tonight. We're going to talk about why this is central to a Green New Deal. We're going to kind of get into the details of what specifically the Act does. And then we're also going to hear directly from workers who have organized their own workplace and kind of the effect that that has had and how the bill would have helped them. And so, yeah, I believe we're missing a screen share here if we want to bring the slides up again. But yeah, first, I'm really excited to introduce our fellow DSA member and state senator for Minnesota District 7, which is northwestern Minnesota, Duluth and the surrounding area. Jennifer McEwen is here. Sorry, Jen McEwen is here. And yeah, thank you so much for being here, Jen. If you want to talk a bit about your experience with organized labor and the environmental justice movement and really what we're fighting for here.
Hey, can you hear me okay?
We can
Great,
indeed.
thanks. So as you can see, I'm in my car. We finished our Senate session and then I busted it to go back up to Duluth, northeastern Minnesota on Lake Superior. I think you said northwestern Minnesota, but I think most people know where Duluth is. But so yeah, we have a pretty active DSA chapter up in the Twin Ports area as well. If you haven't gotten connected to that group, please do. Doing really good work up there and in some other areas as well in the States. So I've, thanks so much for asking me to join you. Just real quick, I'll just kind of give people my quick 2 cents on the a divide that has been, in my opinion, sort of artificially cultivated over recent decades between environmentalists and labor. And in northeastern Minnesota is one of the places where we have seen that divide really, really, like I said, it's been artificially cultivated over many years. And I and others over these years, probably the last decade or so, have sort of seen this divide grow, and it really centered around the polymet mining, the copper sulfide nickel mining proposals, and also line 3. So with those extractive industry projects in particular, we've seen organized labor in the trades really rally behind those projects in particular. And at the same time, labor in the public sector, public service sector, so for example, nurses, teachers, firefighters, in the name of solidarity, not feeling comfortable to take a firm stand against those projects, but yet with their membership, I think I can safely say the membership, I think, not being comfortable with those extractive industry projects. So up in Duluth, we have a very strong labor history and culture. And most of us in Duluth grew up in very strong labor households. We believe in organized labor to our core. That's true for me, that's true for most Duluthians, I think. And at the same time, our economy, our region, our public health, everything is being threatened by this copper sulfide mining projects that are being put forward by these billion-dollar multinational mining conglomerates. And so we've found ourselves in a real quandary. It's been really, really hard for a lot of people in Duluth because we want to support labor, but we also know that this kind of mining would be disastrous. And the fight's been tough, and it has, I think, been emblematic of a divide within the House of Labor that we're really, really seeing now. And I think most recently we just saw it with the, was it the St. Paul Federation of Labor asking the National Guard to leave their House of Labor, and they had been staging there, and we saw that divide. We saw that split where some of organized labor came out with these statements condemning, asking the National Guard to go. Other unions were more supportive, and then it split along some kind of classic lines. Those are the same kind of lines that we're seeing up in Duluth, and we've been in this fight for a while. I think that this merging and bringing together of organized labor, and I don't even want to say the environmental movement, because it's so intersectional. When we're talking about environment, we're talking about so many things: our public health, our economy, our ability to live in our communities. It's so much. But to really have organized labor move us into a just transition, into a clean energy economy, like that is the issue. That is the issue. That's the solution to so many of the ills that we're dealing with right now. And so I'm a first term senator. I was just elected this last fall, and I ran on that. I ran on my connection to labor, and that I am a very, very ardent, strong labor supporter, but I'm also a real labor supporter. I want to be in real solidarity with my community. I want to be in in organized labor that is truly going to be lifting up all workers and be in solidarity with everyone. And unfortunately, I think sometimes we have been in this era of such rampant, out of control capitalism and deregulation and weakening of organized labor that some people in the labor movement, out of, I think, desperation, frankly, and needing to advocate for their membership, have felt compelled to latch on to certain projects, certain pieces of the agenda that are actually the boss's agenda. I mean, who wants to build this copper nickel mine? The big billionaire bosses of Glencore and Antofagasta want to put those mines. Who wants to build line 3? Enbridge and all the money behind that. So it's, sometimes I feel like some of our organized labor forebears are rolling in their graves seeing what's happened in northeastern Minnesota with some of the trades leadership mistaking solidarity for mixing up what it means to be in solidarity with your community. We've seen, in Duluth, some of the trades, they're taking the part of the boss against their own neighbors, volunteer activists, volunteer scientists who are saying, please don't do this. This is going to be a disaster for our community. And then we've seen the trades working against them, and calling them liars and going to war with them. So it has been in a really unfortunate division. And I think I'm so glad that all of you are meeting tonight to talk about the PRO Act, because the PRO Act is so, so important in order to alleviate some of that pressure that many people have been feeling now for a long time. I'm preaching to the choir to talk about wealth disparity and just how crucial and fundamental the role of organized labor is in creating a decent quality of living for people, creating a middle class, creating a thriving economy and a healthy economy where people are actually going to live and thrive in it. So I think, if we could pass the PRO Act at the federal level and really have the trades and organized labor lead us into this transition to a just transition to a clean energy economy, we're going to be able to blow past some of these divisions that have been cultivated in these recent decades, this divide and conquer that's been brought up against us. We're going to be able to just bust through that to what's next and to what's better. And so this is it. This is the struggle. It's the PRO Act. It's getting the PRO Act passed. It's bringing together communities where we're all strong labor supporters. We're also really, really strong about acting on the climate crisis, making a just transition to a clean energy economy, moving into better care for our watersheds, all of those fundamental environmental values. So it's just bringing people together, passing the PRO Act so that labor can lead us into that transition, and so the transition will be just, and it's going to make such a huge difference. So yeah, that's really what I have to offer. That's what I ran my campaign on, and it resonated in Duluth. I think that's because we're Duluthians, that's where they're at, which is promising.
There we go. Thank you so much. So you all heard the senator. It's about getting together. It's about fighting to pass this. So, and yeah, huge shout out to the Twin Ports chapter. We're going to plug, they're going to have an awesome May Day action that is actually sponsored by not only their chapter, but the local Superior Labor Council, and then actually a steel workers local and even a building trades local there. So you see, the divide is really just made up. We're going to all come together to get this passed up. So thank you so much.
It's happening.
Senator. I'm really excited.
Happy May Day, everybody.
Happy May Day. Happy May Day. So
I'm
really excited to introduce our next panelist. He is a DSA member and a longtime unionist who is also a writer and researcher who knows more about the labor movement than anybody else I know, and is great at talking about the intricacies of labor law. And so our good friend Dave Camper here is going to get into exactly what does the PRO Act do and why is it so important? and what are all these things that this legislation is going to change, and why does that matter to organized labor? So I will introduce Dave Camper here.
Thanks so much, Nick. Good evening, everyone. I'm Dave Camper. I'm in Brooklyn Park right now, and I'm a senior state policy coordinator for the Economic Policy Institute, but I am here today in a personal capacity, speaking for no one but myself. What we're going to talk about is what the PRO Act is, what it's going to do. And the first thing I want to say is that this is a law, not everything. This is a legal framework to help improve worker outcomes, to build worker power, but laws aren't everything. A labor lawyer told me once long ago, organize and the law will follow. That's what you have to remember here. So a law is never something that solves every problem, but this is a helpful piece of legislation that would do a wonderfully good job of helping people get unions. Let me talk a bit about why we need this. And the reason we need it is that the law governing private sector unionization has only grown weaker and weaker and weaker over the years. And let me quickly define my terms. When I say private sector unions, what I mean is people who work for a business as opposed to working for some kind of government. People who work for a school district or a city, a county, a state, the federal government, those are public sector employees. And public sector employees have nothing to do with the PRO Act. They're a completely separate category of people. I know a couple of years ago, I guess 3 years ago now, the Supreme Court came out with its Janus decision that really stuck it to public sector workers. The PRO Act doesn't do anything about that. It's still an important issue. We're going to get to that. But the PRO Act is dealing with the private sector. And I'm going to mention two laws only because I don't want to overwhelm us with laws. But the two laws we're talking about that are primarily impacted by this are the 1935 National Labor Relations Act, NLRA, also known as the Wagner Act, but I'll call it the NLRA as much as I can, and the 1947 Taft-Hartley Act, which is a bad bill, a bad law that really undid a lot of what happened when the National Labor Relations Act was passed in 1935. And what happened in the 64 years since the Taft-Hartley, no, 74 years since the Taft-Hartley, I'm old, since the 74 years since the Taft-Hartley bill was passed, is that the legal status of unions compared to the legal strength of employers has gotten more and more unbalanced. In the 1930s, in the 1940s, unions had a fair shot in many ways, not everything. There were still some challenges, don't get me wrong, it wasn't some perfect past. But what's happened since then again and again and again is that employers are getting away with more and more and realizing their power to stop unions is getting stronger and stronger. And the issue here, the thing you need to remember is that the real crime is what's legal. Like there are times when the employer breaks the law during organizing drives, and it always sucks when it does, and it happens a lot. But the crime is what's legal. We saw this in the recent election in Alabama for the Amazon plant in Bessemer. The employer had every legal right to blanket every piece of that work site with anti-union propaganda. They had every legal right to lie to people about what a union was going to do. They had every legal right to keep the union organizers away so they couldn't get in touch with the workers. They had every legal right to try to delay the proceedings again and again and again and again. All of those things were not against the law. They were the rights an employer currently has to screw over workers. And so I'm going to talk a bit about what the PRO Act does now. And for this part, I am going to put a couple of slides up just because there's a lot of words. And I want to make sure we know what we're talking about. All right, can everyone seeing my screen? I got a thumbs up from Anders. Excellent. All right. So, well, I'll go back to this first. So there are four corners to the PRO Act. One corner is employers, workers, unions, the government. All right, employers, workers, unions, the government. These are the four corners affected by the PRO Act. And I'm going to talk about each one in turn. Employers, the PRO Act will give them fewer opportunities to screw with people. The first thing it will do is we'll deal with worker misclassification, which we've dealt with from Uber to everything in between. And it will use the famous / infamous ABC test, which will mean that if you're working for someone, you're going to have a right to collective bargaining even if they decide to call you a contractor. Now, there's a lot of myths coming out about this, and I'll address those in just a sec, so hang with me on that. But this misclassification issue is a big one because right now a lot of workers, subcontracted part workers on construction sites, Uber drivers, like I said, people who are hired by staffing agencies to go work at a place but work full-time there, are being misclassified. And as a result, they don't even have collective bargaining rights. Now, this is going to give it to them. The PRO Act will also end an employer's right to make mandatory arbitration clauses part of an employment contract. You can come work for us, but the only way you can come work for us is if you sign away your right to sue us. The Epic Systems case was a Supreme Court case a few years ago. We all know Epic Systems here in town, that said that these things were legal. Well, the PRO Act is going to change that. It's going to change employer standing in National Labor Relations Board cases. What I mean by that is the National Labor Relations Board is going to once again become a space where workers talk about forming a union, not where employers get to stick their beak into every piece of it. And the biggest change it's going to make to employers that's great is it's going to ban the permanent replacement of striking workers. Right now, if you go on strike, you cannot be fired for going on strike if it's a legal strike under the National Labor Relations Act. You can be permanently replaced. And if you want to know what the difference is, I can't tell you, right? I mean, there is, but I'm not going to, it's ridiculous. And it's scared people away for good reason from striking for a very long time. Permanent replacement of strikers will be banned under the PRO Act. Now I'm going to talk to the unions, the tools that the unions will have. They're going to have faster processes. They're going to have access to the work site. They're going to re-legalize provisions around hot cargo, which is something along the lines of, if I'm driving a truck and I have a union, I don't have to carry the cargo of an employer whose employees are on strike. I can refuse to carry that cargo. And it's also going to re-legalize secondary boycotts, where if I'm organizing a union at Amazon, I can go put pressure on Kohl's, who sells products through Amazon, not to do work through Amazon to put pressure on them. I can explain those in greater detail later. Just trust me, they're complicated. It's good that we get them back. But the big three things, big deals here all, for what happens for a union once the PRO Act passes. The first is interest arbitration for first contracts. 50%, 1 in 2, half of all unions that organize fail to get a contract. The employer has unlimited tools at their disposal to delay and delay and delay and scare you and all these things. And so half the time people go through all the trouble of forming a union, they don't even get a contract. This would require interest arbitration for a first contract, which would mean if you got to a place where you couldn't get to a deal, a third party, a neutral third party comes in and decides the contract. Now, a lot of people, I'll tell you, who believe in unions don't love this idea of interest arbitration because they think it takes power out of the hands of workers. I hear you, and I understand that point. Half of workers aren't getting a contract right now. We need to get workers a contract. If we don't get that, the rest of it doesn't matter. The second great change for unions is it's going to bring in card check in extreme cases. What card check means is if you get more than 50% of the workforce to sign a card saying, I want to have a union, that's your election. You just had the election. Everyone signed a card saying they want a union. You get to have that. Now, it's not automatic. It's only going to happen if the employer has violated the law. But that's okay, because we can win elections if we have a fair chance. But card check in extreme cases. And then this is the biggest one, is it repeals state right to work laws. Right now, in a majority of states in the country, not in Minnesota, thank goodness, but in a majority of states in the country, workers who are in a unionized workplace don't have to join the union. In fact, no one can be forced to join a union in the United States. It's a violation of our Constitution, right to association. But in Minnesota, if your workplace is covered by a union, the union has a right to charge you some fee, generally called an agency fee or something similar to that, to cover the costs of representing you. And the reason that's important is because the union has to represent you, even if you hate the union. If you spit in the union organizer's face every time they come around, but you need help, that person has to go to that union, has to go to bat for you. And so the fairness of that is you got to pay your fair share. Well, in most of the states of the union right now, they don't have to do that. And so employers can use this to pull employees apart from each other and from their union. This is going to repeal state right to work laws. It's a big honking deal. It really is. Now I'm going to talk about the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB. That's the agency that enforces the National Labor Relations Act. You see, NLRA, NLRB. One of the biggest things that we have seen happen over the last 74 years is that the National Labor Relations Board has become weaker and less capable of doing its job. And so then the PRO Act does a bunch of cool things to help the National Labor Relations Board. It creates new legal tools, especially the ability to file injunctions, to get a court on the record immediately to stop employer behavior or to impose a decision immediately without having to go through 44 hearings in 16 weeks before you get there. It's going to create increased sunshine into employer anti-union efforts. The Obama administration actually had this rule in place for a period of time. The Trump shockingly took it away, but it'll increase disclosure and sunshine so it's easier to see how employers are screwing over unions. It's going to help get the National Labor Relations Board get more resources. One of the things that's fascinating, and I could do a whole 15 minutes on this, but I can't today, is that the National Labor Relations Board is forbidden by the Taft-Hartley Act, like forbidden by the law from doing economic analysis. They're forbidden from doing that. Their job is to help run the collective bargaining system of the country, but they're not allowed to do economic analysis. How crazy is that? The reason is because back then the National Labor Relations Board was doing economic analysis, and it was showing things like inequality is bad, unions are good, capitalists are ripping everyone off, because that's in fact what the facts say. And so the Taft-Hartley Act took that right away. The last power that the National Labor Relations Board gets out of this is the right to impose damages of a higher level. Right now, if Anders here, who's my fellow panelist, if he were to try and join a union in his workplace and he were to get fired, of course he didn't, he's going to tell you his story soon, but let's say he gotten fired, and let's say it was clearly a violation of the law, because you can't be fired for union activity. And let's say the National Labor Relations Board took his case on and took him and took it all the way through, and Anders got his job back. What's the penalty to the employer? The penalty to the employer is simply they have to pay Anders the wages he would have earned while he was working there. However, if during this time while it was going on, Anders got another job to pay the rent, they only have to pay him the difference between what he would have earned at his now unionized job versus what he got when he was there. And so it could be almost nothing. This is going to create triple damages. So you're going to actually have a financial cost to the employer for firing people. Right now, it frankly makes reasonable business sense for an employer to fire union organizers. It's an entirely rational decision for an employer to make. It's evil, but it's rational. And this is going to change that. The last corner of our four corners here is the workers themselves. And I separated unions and workers because while I think workers and unions are the same thing, I want to talk about individual worker rights here as separate from union rights as their own thing. The first is there's a ban on captive audience meetings. The employer cannot now, under the PRO Act, cannot force you to go into a room and listen to management tell lies about the union. This is something that people who are involved in union drives will tell you can be incredibly demoralizing, that the boss sits you down and just lies at you for 2 hours every day when you're supposed to be getting work done. Like they're all about productivity all darn day until it's time for the captive audience meeting. There's going to be individual rights to sue employees. And in this case, to collect potentially punitive damages, which is the sort of thing that you always get in the law shows where it's $10 million in damages. Not that I'm saying you're going to get $10 million if the PRO Act passes, but it's a big deal to potentially, as an individual, as opposed to a union, an individual having the right to sue for violations of the National Labor Relations Act and collect damages. And then this last one, which is great, it's going to allow you to use company equipment for union communications. Now, it can't be on the clock, just like the employer can, but you can use your company email now. You can use your company meeting space to do so. It's not going to be unlimited. There's going to be some bits and pieces, but this is a really big thing for freedom of people to have a right to make their own decision, because this is what it comes down to here. The PRO Act is about creating the conditions for workers to make their own decisions. And it's not automatic unionism. I happen to believe compulsory unionism would be a great thing. We're not there. And that's not what this is. It's about clearing everything out so the worker can make a decision. So I really quick want to address 3 common myths, well, 2.5 myths anyway, about this, just because I want to make sure I address them. The first is this thing I mentioned earlier about freelancers and the so-called ABC test. The ABC test it comes out of California. I mean, it's a long established test in many states, but basically the question is who actually is an employee of the company. So if I work for, say I get a job at McDonald's, McDonald's isn't actually my employer. It's the franchisor, the guy who owns the McDonald's franchise in that neighborhood who's my employer. But McDonald's decides what kind of uniform I have to wear, what kind of equipment I have to have, what kind of safety training I get. And right now, McDonald's can evade, like McDonald's as the big company, can evade responsibility for what its franchisors do. With better language around classification, McDonald's, the big companies, can be responsible for the actions of its franchisees. That's a big deal. Uber is going to be responsible for the employees it has who it claims are independent contractors. Now, there's a category of people out there, many of them being people who are freelance writers, and I am occasionally a freelance writer, so I know whereof you speak, who say, I'm worried that if this happens, that the magazine I write for sometimes will simply won't employ me. Now, the first thing I want to make clear is that all the PRO Act changes is who has a right to join a union. It does not change in any way, shape, or form who's eligible for overtime or who gets pensions or who has other various rights under law. The PRO Act only deals with who has a right to join a union. It would not change those other things. I think those things ought to change, but that's not what this is doing right now. And so any concerns from the California experience aren't relevant here. And what I would say to people who have that concern is if your employment is so precarious that you're worried about your boss having to, you're not being able to hire you if they have to treat you with a decent modicum of respect, we've got bigger problems here. And let's address those, and the PRO Act's the way to do that. The second myth I want to address, and I don't think it's likely to be a myth that prevails in this particular audience, but you never know, is that this PRO Act is going to create an open field for union thugs, people like me with a crowbar and a 3-body trunk, to go around and force you all to join a union. If only I could do so. That was a joke for those of you watching at home. I want to make clear here, right? A union has nothing like the coercive power that an employer has, right? Employers have coercive power over you 8 hours a day or however many hours it is. They can talk to you every second of it. They can threaten your job. A union doesn't have that. A union is the workers. A union is the workers. And if there's a work site where the workers do not want to have a union, there's nothing in this law that's going to make them have a union they don't want. Now, I hope everyone wants a union. I think everyone should have a union. I work for a fantastic employer, but I have a union. I'm a member of the Nonprofit Employees Union, very proud of it. But everyone should have a union. But this is not going to force anybody. The card check provision in the law is sometimes used by opponents of the law to say it's going to be some kind of sneaky thing that people are going to get snuck into the union without even realizing it. I have a higher opinion of the intelligence of the average American worker than that. I think people know what they're getting into and they know what they're going to do forward. And so I have confidence in this, but there's no thugs going around. And in fact, the flip side of this is my third thing I want to make clear, and especially for this audience, and this is the last point I'll make, especially for this audience, which is the Twin Cities DSA, and thanks all of you for being here for this. This law does nothing if we don't organize. We can get the best damn labor law passed in the world, and it doesn't matter for squat if the day after it passes we aren't out there talking to every person we know about forming a union, if we aren't volunteering our time and our energy to help them, if we aren't reaching out to people we know who can help us to help them. If we pass this law and we don't go and organize workers, no one will ever take organized labor seriously in this country again. So it's on all of us who believe in the power of workers that if this bill, or even some part of it, becomes law, that the next day we are out there doing all we can to get as many workers in unions as possible. That's the most important thing here. The law will not save us. The law, the PRO Act, if it passes, will give us an opportunity to do things we can't now. It will give us a greater chance to push the good fight, and it will give workers a more meaningful voice in the job, but we still have to do the work. And I want to thank you all for the time. I know there were a couple of questions, but I think we'll move on with the rest of the program, and then I can answer the questions later on. I think that sounds good. And I'm going to drop, because I forgot to do this at the beginning, I'm going to drop into the chat a link to a Google document of some resources I put together for you, things you can read if you want to know more. Thanks so much. Nick, back to you.
All right, thank you so much, Brother Dave. As I said, a person who knows labor like the back of his hand and I can always rely on to explain any term under the sun for me. So a valuable resource indeed. I'm super excited for our next guests. I'm going to kick it over to Anders, who is a Twin Cities DSA member and also a member of Unite Here 17. Anders is going to be introducing Crystal as well, who's also a member of Unite Here 17. And we're going to talk a little bit about what is it actually like to have a union in your workplace? What is the process currently under the status quo of getting a union? And really, what does this mean for our fight for the PRO Act?
Thank you, Nick. Like Nick said, my name is Anders. And I'll let Crystal introduce herself a little bit more thoroughly in just a moment here. The two of us, you may have heard, if you haven't heard our names specifically, last year, there was a wonderful wave of labor organizing in the Twin Cities in a couple of different areas, and in particular amongst the service industry, specifically amongst several breweries, distilleries, and a local coffee shop chain. Not all of these efforts were successful in the end, but several of them were. My location, Fair State Brewing Cooperative, we did get voluntary recognition. Crystal's location, Tattersall Distillery, won their union election. And then a couple other smaller distilleries, Stillhart and Lawless, also won voluntary recognition this past year. And so we're just going to kind of talk a little bit here tonight, tell our stories if you haven't heard them before, or if you have, you'll get to hear them again. Kind of describe a few kind of the broad outlines of what we experienced, because there is some interesting compare and contrast. You know, we've got a couple of different businesses that are in the same relative industry, that are all in the same Twin Cities metro. We all organized under the same union, Unite Here Local 17. But we definitely had very different experiences. We had a very wide range of experiences, you know, with all those other factors being the same. And really it just kind of, I think, helps illustrate what is kind of like the big difference that exists right now, simply based upon how your employer decides to react when you go in and you know, tell them, hey there, boss, we've decided to form a union. You know, hopefully you'll recognize it in the next 24 hours before we make a public statement. And with these kind of illustration of what was the differences between each of our places, excuse me, hopefully that can also help to illustrate what are some of the things that would be different had the PRO Act in its current form have been in law a year ago. And what sorts of things that might have been easier at one location, you know, but much more difficult at another location, could have been much more balanced. And even some of the stuff that was easier for some places could have been easier still. So for myself, we announced our union right after Labor Day last year. So I believe that was like September 3rd or 4th. Several of us there had been organizing for almost 2 years. We've been kind of having various discussions at the brewery. We definitely found our work situation to be decent, especially compared to what is oftentimes the case in the craft brewing industry. Little bit better pay, good benefits, things like that. But even still, there was issues. There was issues with kind of a lack of a solid structure when there was anything related to like discipline of an employee. There was kind of difficulty in judging like, okay, I started with a decent paycheck. Now I've been here for a while. Where does this go from here? How do I get a raise? You know, what is, if I want to move up to a different position, how does that work? And, you know, that all of that combined with, you know, all of the other upheaval that we experienced both nationwide and especially locally last year, kind of threw a lot of things into contrast. And it went from a handful of us who had been talking and occasionally meeting to discuss about, you know, should we move forward with trying to organize a union, to suddenly an overwhelming majority of us across different departments in the tap room, in the production facility, and even several office people all saying, yeah, I believe it's time for us to, you know, have some sort of structural change to how things are done at our workplace. How do we make sure that the good stuff that we actually do like doesn't just go away with a wave of a hand? Because frankly, it could have. You know, if some new person in leadership decided to make a change, then they could just make a change. And then also, how do we make sure that we are able to, bargain for better situations, so that we can bargain for better pay, that we can bargain for, different changes in our benefits, even if they're good, maybe they don't actually kind of fit what people's life situations are over time. So we announced, we were very fortunate. The people in leadership positions at Fair State Brewing Co-op were amenable. We did kind of the typical thing of, please give us a answer within 24 hours. They asked for a little bit more time. We agreed. And then, by the next day, we were having discussions about voluntary recognition and how to make like a public announcement about the entire thing. And then after that, it has been not without, some tension, some contention, but we have been able to jump into having regular contract negotiations. Just a few weeks ago, we ended the part of our contract negotiations that, would be defined as non-economic. So things like discipline structure, things like PTO, things of that nature. And then soon we'll be entering into the part that's, straightforwardly economic, pay, healthcare, things like that. The Fair State Brewing Co-op bosses have been, more than willing to utilize the union and put the union label and union made on various products that we have. So it's been kind of a nice little boost and bonus, to our, public perception, both for the union and for the employer. So we've been very lucky in that regard. But that, again, as wonderful as that is, and as happy as I am about that, it certainly, gives me kind of a sour taste when I think about it more than a second. The fact that, like, it shouldn't just be up to the good graces of somebody in charge of your job to give you that sort of good deal. It shouldn't just be because they're a nice person, or because they, have like a political or intellectual, approval of unions, even if they are an employer. That sucks. That's the reason that it happens like that. So I want to kind of bring in my comrade and union sibling Crystal here, and have her talk a little bit about what was the experience at Tattersall, and then kind of the two of us can kind of talk a little bit about what happened at some of the other locations in the area this past year, and what would have been different overall had the PRO Act been in place. So, Crystal, if you're ready, take it away and give yourself a quick intro and a little history of the Tattersall union efforts.
Yeah, hi guys. My name's Crystal. I'm, as Anders said, with Tattersall and Unite 17, Unite Here 17. And yeah, I guess I would start with kind of our history into unionizing began with the pandemic coming on in March. And essentially, the cocktail room shut down, as many of the restaurants had been called in order to do from Governor Walz. And when we were getting called back around June, and places were starting to mistakenly open again, we had gotten a COVID preparedness plan in an email and asked for our availability. We had gone over this plan, and we all, like many who were, I think, justifiably hesitant about going into work as we're watching the numbers climb, had a lot of questions. And so nobody wanted to give their availability until, we were having meetings amongst ourselves. It was about 19, 20 of us front of house staff. And we all kind of agreed that we'd rather have a in-person meeting, because the preparedness plan just wasn't hashing out details. And we were all pretty frightened of going back to work and having to interact with the public, regardless of what the safety protocol was. The fact of the matter was, at that point, especially, once you were out of your house, you're pretty much in danger. Never mind when you're in a location for 8 to 12 hours of the day, which many of us, when we pulled doubles, contact with different people all day, your chances are through the roof, of contracting it. So we thought it was pretty fair to at least have a meeting before giving our availability. And that was our only ask, in an email to the bosses. And for whatever reason that I'm sure they're regretting now, they took offense to the fact that we didn't just accept the COVID preparedness plan and that they had our best interest. They felt insulted by it, and essentially told us that the new terms were they were not going to have a meeting before, and now, so that they could cover everyone's individual needs, because we sent an email collectively, they were going to have us pretty much re-interview for our positions that we already had and speak to us individually to tend to those needs. And so we got pretty frightened, because there was the threat at that point that if we didn't give our availability now, we would not have a position. And we had gotten word from in the distillery that from a friend and someone who was in management, that who was really worried about the situation, that if we hadn't given our availability by the end of the weekend, they were going to contact UI and say that we declined employment, and so we were all going to lose our UI. It was at that point that we then got in touch with RockMN, and we were seeking out help or how to combat this, because it felt pretty out of control that could snap your fingers, lose your job over something. Mind you, we're not asking for higher wages. We were not asking for maternity leave. It was just a basic, can we have a meeting before availability? And these are people who, and I'm sure if anyone who's in any industry, or this is really any corporation or company touts this, but especially in the service industry, the whole family rhetoric, right? Every email, every holiday party, there's the talk of the closeness and family and that jargon. And so it was especially interesting because one of the owners, and a lot of the employees had worked together side by side in restaurants in the past. I mean, there were strong relationships, and yet even with that, they were willing to do that to their quote unquote family. So that's when things I think really put into perspective, especially for many of us. We come from working class, lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and families who had been part of unions, but I think most of us, if not all, had never been part of one. And so even though we were familiar, this was a point when RockMN had connected us with Shay in Unite, and we got more informed on our own accord, but also through talking to him and then talking through with other comrades about essentially what the union could do for us. And even though a lot of us were kind of hesitant going into it, and that was purely out of not knowing, it essentially became really the only and most logical outlet. And it was actually most surprising how we had never thought about it before, because we had been under this impression, I think, as so many have been and so many still are, that the boss is just not someone you mess with, because you have to put food on your plate, you have bills to pay, especially many of us living paycheck to paycheck, and so you're kind of just at their will. But when it got to such a point that was such a slap in our face of just how easily our lives could be turned around because someone wasn't happy with an action that was by no means that serious, the union was, the only way to go. And so I think the PRO Act, it became pretty nasty during the process when we told them that we wanted them to recognize us as a union. They were completely taken by surprise. They needed more time to look at, the contract that was presented in front of them. And of course, we had told them we'd give them, similar to Anders, X amount of time. We even pushed that and said, but if you don't respond, we're going to go public. And they tried to beat us to that punch, and it failed quite miserably because they posted that same morning that we were supposed to. We gave them a time. They posted before us saying that, you know, this was all going on and that they did not think the union was right for their company. And of course, there was a wild backlash from the public of why we weren't given the opportunity to make that choice for ourselves. They turned off the comments, which was yet another mistake. And then everybody took to Facebook. And then they finally turned it back on and said it was only, and it was really only kind of, as much as I curse social media, because of social media, you know, and things being taken to the public, that these companies, corporations, small businesses start to listen when it's their image, you know, being threatened. And again, we didn't even do anything yet. They did it to themselves. And then that's kind of when, you know, the longer road to getting the election, which we eventually won, with only, I think, 2 people voting against and 17 of us voting for the union. But down that road, it very contrary to Anders' experience, there has not, even to this day, almost, gosh, we're, you know, getting to May, we're almost approaching a year. There is really, we're just getting contact from them within the past couple months about and that's only because they're reopening next month in June. And so besides that, though, it's been crickets. And granted, there's been a lot of, you know, logistical stuff, but with, you know, the PRO Act, I don't know that we would have had to wait this long. And even the election process, this allows also for these bosses and these spaces to wait out people. And they know very well that folks aren't waiting for jobs, you know, that long. And so many people end up getting another job. And especially when it is a nasty campaign, and especially when the energy is so sour, folks don't necessarily want to go back after the exhaustion of such a process. And they know that. And so they try to lengthen that out, which I think, you know, had that not been the case, things would have been much easier and more people would be inclined to have stayed. We have, luckily, a great number of folks that, even though a lot of us have needed other jobs and have gotten other jobs, many of us are going to go back because we certainly want to see this through. But that just isn't the case. And, you know, it was interesting to hear the fact about how most contracts don't get, I think it was around 50%, he said, do not end up being made because the back and forth and the length of time. And I was not surprised by that, given our experience currently. We just started our bargaining or negotiations and, you know, gave them our asks, and it's the non-economic portion. And so we should be hearing back hopefully sooner than later. But again, it's a lengthy process. And luckily we are, you know, it's now happening. But yeah, if only we had more legal action and protection for these movements, you know, because right now it's just so in their favor. I think the process would have been much easier, even if, you know, they aren't making it any easier in the place, because, you know, our distillers have been there the whole time. And unfortunately, and this again with the PRO Act, I think would be very different, have experienced pretty negative reactions. For example, 5 months ago, or I think maybe longer than that, post our unionizing, one of the distillers walked into the locker room, and a photo of him that was on a board that we had with a bunch of photos. They had taken pretty much everyone's photo down. His was one of the only remaining because he was still working there. He found a pin in his forehead in the photo. No one else works. There's only the 3 distillers, the head distiller, who's not in the union because he's a boss, the owners, and some other people in management. So imagine walking into your place of work and a bunch of people who are pretty much 40 and older. They're your bosses, you know, doing some high school childish mean girl shit like that. Sorry, excuse my language, but you can only imagine what it is for 3 people who are part of the union having to walk into that place of work every day, knowing that there's this kind of loathing energy happening around them. And, it's just not a comfortable space that you have to work your whole day through. So I think, again, with the PRO Act, these sort of actions, the way that they've been behaving towards the distillers that could border, retaliatory, because that they're walking that line. They're not doing anything necessarily right out illegal, but they're making their lives miserable, so to speak. I think those things would be much more difficult for them to have to do. And so that's where we are up to date. And yeah, like I said, a very different experience, but yeah.
I know we're kind of running towards the end of our little section here, Crystal, but I think about even what some of our fellow organizers at like Surly and Spy House, where the employer, playing all sorts of games with closures and, captive audience stuff. And it's like, there would have been, there would have been some muscle and some teeth to push back against that. And how those locations, because of all those games, the union ended up, to try and get some sort of election so that they could get recall rights in with closures, that, they agreed to non-NLRB elections, which had different criteria, different thresholds. So they ended up losing union elections that under different circumstances they would have won. And how that with the PRO Act, they would have had better elections sooner. They would have been properly done. And if the numbers had been the same, they would have won. And both of those locations would be unionized today. So it just kind of illustrates how, there needs to be organizing on the ground. But boy, there's just ways that it can be just that much easier, and just all that organizing can actually get you over the finish line rather than getting screwed over by a technicality.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think we really hit the nail on the head between what Crystal said and Dave said it as well, which is even if we do pass the PRO Act, that's not going to be enough, right? And the flip side of that is that, I mean, I'm a unionist myself, but the organized labor as it exists right now is actually not enough to get this passed either. And so what we've seen, and this is what really excites me about this, is DSA's nationwide campaign to get the PRO Act passed. We have been phone banking in a really specific, awesome way to flip senators to supporting the PRO Act, which is we're calling voters, a lot of whom are union members in states like Arizona, in West Virginia, in Virginia, and getting them to call their senators and basically flooding their voicemails to the point where they can't receive any more messages. And it really ticks off the senators and gets them hyped up about it. DSA, through this campaign and also partnering with organized labor, we've been able to flip Angus King onto the PRO Act, and then recently Joe Manchin, who is the kind of moderate / right-wing Democrat who's like the turning point, said that he's going to he's going to co-sponsor the PRO Act as well. So really the remaining targets are Kyrsten Sinema in Arizona. Sorry, the other person from Arizona, and then there's one more who I'm forgetting. Maybe put it in the chat and I'll shout them out. But you can get involved by going to the national campaign. Mark Kelly, thank you. You can get involved by going to proact.dsa.usa.org. This is where you'll find out how to get on those phones. There's a phone bank tomorrow. I've done this before and it is really exciting. It is definitely the most fun and engaging phone banking that I've personally ever done. If you also want to get involved, these dialers that we're using cost a lot of money. And we, as an organization, we didn't budget enough for how exciting and how huge this is going to be. So you can go to that website. You can also donate so that we can buy more of these dialers so we can make more phone banks. But what's really exciting is that May Day, May 1st, the International Workers' Day, kind of the big celebration of the workers' struggle, the labor struggle, and the socialist struggle is coming up this Saturday. And all across Minnesota, there are going to be a bunch of awesome events. Here in the Twin Cities, DSA is going to be joining a PROACT contingent that is going to be joining the big May Day march that is going to go by the hospitals, which I mentioned earlier. We're going to be meeting in the parking lot of the Lake Street Kmart. We're hoping to be very visible, wearing red, hopefully having big red flags. So that's going to be at 2 p.m. on Saturday. Come out and join us. It's going to be super fun and super celebratory. If you're in the Brainerd area, we have a brand new DSA chapter called Brainerd Lakes Area DSA. You can check out their Facebook page. They're going to be marching to City Hall on May Day with the support of their local AFL-CIO affiliate to be demanding the PROACT. And then finally, if you're up in Jennifer McEwen's district, I never get cardinal directions right. It's northeastern Minnesota, not northwestern Minnesota. The Twin Ports DSA chapter is going to be doing an awesome march at noon on Saturday at City Center Park. They're going to be joined by a lot of cool local unions like the Steel Workers, the local AFL-CIO, and also the local Building Trades Council as well. Thank you all so much for tuning into this. I hope you guys are excited as I am about being able to pass this. This is a possibility. I just want to stress that. I know we are used to things being stacked against us. We are used to losing all the time, but we have really never been in a better situation than now to really pass super significant reform that is going to really juice up unions. What we need to be doing is we need to be making those calls. We need to be talking to our coworkers. We need to be going to these rallies. We need to be calling our senators and demanding that this get passed. And then the day after it gets passed, we're going to be hitting the streets. We're going to be hitting up those coworkers that we talk to. We're going to be building unions, and we are going to bring back union density, higher wages, stability, just cause discipline, really awesome benefits, a steward for everyone, everything that you need in a good union contract. These human rights that truly every worker deserves, we're going to be getting those to everyone. This is just the first step. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. If you're not a member of DSA, you can join by going to dsausa.org/join, and we'll hope to see you this Saturday at May Day.